Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. On behalf of everyone at Rev.io, I would like to thank you for joining us today. Before we begin the presentation, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. First, audio will automatically come in through your computer speakers. However, if you're having trouble using your speakers or unhappy with the quality of the sound, you can also dial in using the phone number and access code listed on the screen. Second, a recorded version of this webinar will be emailed to you within 2 weeks. We will be having a Q&A session at the end of the event, but please feel free to submit your questions using the GoToWebinar control panel at any time during the event. Any questions that we don't get to today will be addressed via email after the end of the presentation. For those of you just joining us today, welcome. Chris Lee from CloudAge Solutions will be sharing strategies for automating your back office to improve operating efficiency, margins, and customer retention. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Chris.
Thank you, Olivia, and welcome everyone. It's great to be here today and to discuss back office automation with you. Again, this is Chris Lee, founder and CEO of CloudAge Solutions. A little bit about my bio, and then we'll jump into the actual meat of the webinar. I have about 30 years of experience in the telecom industry, in the functional areas of network engineering, network cost management, cost optimization, corporate finance, and billing. Worked for industry leaders such as Cablevision and MCI, as well as companies that I founded myself or with others, including a company that we founded in 1999 called Broadmargin. We were a service provider to competitive carriers who offered network cost management software and service solutions. At the end of the run, we had Broadmargin. We ran it for about 4 years. We managed at the end of it in 2003, we managed about $8 billion of cost, and the company ended up being sold to a private equity firm. After that, I founded what is today CloudAge Solutions in 2005, and we provide both SaaS and professional services that optimize the key back office functions, including network cost management. All right, let's get rolling here. So as far as an agenda, I'm not going to stick to this exactly. Really what I'm going to do today on the webinar is to talk about, look at the current state of the telecom industry as well as talking about back office automation and cost management for the emerging providers. And then we'll get to some Q&A at the end. All right, so looking at today's telecom industry, there's some really interesting trends that are going on. It offers opportunities for emerging carriers as well as, there's tremendous amount of change that has to be managed and dealt with. Looking at like in the marketplace, the larger carriers, more the AT&T and Verizon side of the market, they are moving up market. So in terms of their sales focus, they're really focusing on more medium enterprise up to large enterprise, and really leaning on the channel to do a lot of the sales and managing the customer. And this is a great trend, and it's been going on for several years now. The channel is just becoming more and more important, especially in the sort of the SMB up to medium enterprise markets, and does create great market opportunities for emerging carriers. So it's a really great trend, and I think a lot of you on the phone today or on the webinar today are benefiting from that. At the same time, there's lots of different technology services coming into the market. There's great service opportunities with things like SD-WAN. There's lots of different technologies that emerging carriers need to integrate into their services. Driving API opportunities, and it's really over time has really changed the way that emerging providers deliver services. Back when I was at MCI, back in those days, you had to build all your facilities, your real estate as well as your network facilities. There were no Equinix that we could go put, get a rack in and then connect all the carriers within the colo center. So there's a lot of change in there, and so again, offering great opportunities. But on the other side of it, carriers today now are really what I call integrators. They need to be able to integrate various services from multiple vendors and manage those services. And that's really, I think, the key challenge facing the emerging providers today is to be an integrator and to be able to kind of manage all that and do it so on a cost-effective basis. All right, so I created this slide for another presentation I gave recently, and I thought it was a really interesting way to look at the state of the market today by looking at some of the major carriers out there. And calling some of these carriers is probably not the right description either. But what this slide does is it looks at the financial performance of these various telecom operators from a perspective of how much asset they have deployed and what their valuation is. And for a proxy, the way to analyze how much asset, so the bottom statistic, the PPE over TA, that stands for property, plant, and equipment over total assets. So you see the three carriers on the left, Zayo, Frontier, Windstream, all have what I call asset heavy. They have lots of asset. And the financial statistic, the revenue multiple, this is how much equity market cap, so the value of their equity as a function of their revenue. So you can see someone like a Zayo has a revenue multiple of about 2.3, which is good. They have a lot of assets and they generate good cash flow and valuation off of those assets. But if you look at someone like Frontier or Windstream, they have significantly more assets but have extremely low valuation. So really, the type of assets you own, and these are all ILEC, and this is all the old copper network, and there's not a ton of value being driven by those assets. If we look at something like a GTT, they were an asset-light carrier. They've acquired Hibernia and Interroute, so it's basically bulked up on a lot of assets, and so that kind of hit their valuation. They also bulked up on a lot of debt. The two providers on the right, Vonage and Ring Central, are really the kind of poster children of the asset-light movement. As you can see, they have very low assets, but the revenue multiples are very high when you look at someone like a Ring Central. And Ring Central is really not considered, and neither does Vonage, consider themselves to be a telecom carrier, though they're really a software company, and that's kind of what we're seeing out there in the emerging space. The companies that are deploying UC platforms, they're really viewing themselves as a software provider, and they're getting that multiple. The 12.5x revenue multiple for Ring Central is really crazy multiple. And so to sum the slide up, basically, the emerging providers really, need to kind of get to more of a digital transformed back office capability and platform, and kind of really be able to be more efficient in how they drive cash flow generation. All right, so some of the other things emerging providers really need to do and need to look at are really looking at margin management, like automating process and optimizing networks, and through the validation. We'll get into a lot of these areas throughout the webinar. The next thing is really looking at the process of how the back office performed across things like ordering and quoting, ordering, and inventory, and kind of making those processes conform to what really you need to kind of drive the business and support your customers. And then third thing is looking at visibility to all of these functional areas that can support good decision making. This slide shows the best practice, or we're going to talk about the telecom life cycle here and talk about best practices across that life cycle. As you can see, the telecom life cycle is a very ugly process. It's a large set of interrelated processes. It's really broken down into three phases. The first phase on the left, the sales, procurement, installation phase, is where you're procuring services. Your customer, your sales rep are selling, you're procuring and installing. The middle phase is really when these services are in service, and then the final phase is the decommission phase. And really, this life cycle talks more about like services like circuits and those sorts of things. We're to get into the details of that. So first part of that is the sourcing process, and again, sourcing is really the processes of either working, getting contracting for circuits, or actually doing quoting and processing. Quotes and processing inventory or services that way. In terms of looking at best practice, there's really two types of sourcing here at work. We would call it, one is called what I call contractual sourcing. This is where you're sourcing services that will be on like a 2 or 3 year contract. So typically in the emerging carrier space, we're talking about circuits like network transport or internet connectivity at the network level, as opposed to customer circuits, which are more transactional. So you're buying customer circuits as you sell service to customers. So these two types of sourcing are fundamentally very different and have different capabilities that are required to manage them. So going down the path and down the left-hand column here and talk about contractual sourcing. And so some best practice tips here on contractual sourcing are, the first one is you really need to maintain an optimal environment in terms of carriers. Carrier competition is really going to drive the best deals across these vendors, and so you need to kind of maintain that environment, but not over split your spend so that's too low that you can't drive value with each vendors. Really have to understand the leverage model when you're negotiating. So leverage is really related to how much you have to give the carrier, and that's kind of a game they play. The more incremental revenue you can kind of show that you have and give, the better you can do deals, and certainly easier to drive a better deal with a new vendor than it is with an incumbent in some cases. So just kind of know where the leverage is. Really have to be up on this, the current benchmark. So if you don't have a good handle on that, I suggest to get help, from a consultant or someone that has the handle on that, because that's really probably one of the key tips in getting better sourcing deals, is understanding really what the rates are for someone in your situation. Another thing is big is, as much as you can, resist revenue commitments, because they really they kind of they take away your flexibility, and you don't really have to do revenue commitments on the carrier side for most services. There's certain things like local inbound and stuff like that you may have to, but for the most part you can get away without doing those and still do great deals. This next one's another pet peeve of mine, are auto renews. I hate auto renews in contracts, especially if you don't have a good inventory and contract management capability. Nothing worse than going to look at a circuit that you need to terminate and finding out that 3 months earlier auto renewed for the same price for 3 years. So I hate auto renews. I don't accept them, and neither should you. Another tip is portability language. A lot of contracts, a lot of vendors, you can get portability. So language, what portability allows you to do is to exchange circuits. So if you have to disconnect the circuit, you can exchange it for a new circuit if you have one coming in the next month or two. Of similar value, the same or higher value, and so it gets you out of some termination liability. And then all the contracts that all the items like circuits that you would contract for on a contractual basis, sourcing basis, they all basically terminate at the same time. So you really have to have a good inventory handle on your inventory to kind of manage those. Jumping over to the transactional sourcing side, so. This is really what I talked about, is more quoting, and on the voice side be LCR, and so quoting of circuits. So one of the first tips is this: really, you need to understand when you're buying circuits and you're quoting circuits out with vendors, like understanding how the service is delivered. So example is a 50 meg circuit that's delivered on an EOC, Ethernet over copper, versus delivered on fiber infrastructure is a very different thing, both from its functionality and performance as well as its cost. And so you need to know the difference of that and kind of adjust your sourcing strategy appropriately. Knowing who owns the asset, like fiber, is very important. So if you're looking at a quote from like a vendor like XO, but the actual circuit they're trying to sell you is owned, the fiber is owned by Level 3, you're much better off going to Level 3 to get that service from them directly. The last thing is really talking about cost efficient, automation capability. So when you're going, typically, for a typical opportunity, you're going to probably quote 3 to 5 vendors. And so if you have a lot of opportunities going on each month, you need to have an efficient system that can manage large quote volumes. On the voice side, in the LCR, so really need to do LCR on the outbound and toll-free side. LCR is not only a great thing from the cost management standpoint and cost standpoint, it's also really helpful in maintaining a much more robust and resilient network. Your capabilities have to meet your sales and time frame. There's a risk if you can't quote out quickly enough that sales opportunities can be disrupted. And then last thing on the sourcing side, you really need to support downstream processes. So meaning if you get a quote from a vendor that you choose to go and order that service, you really want to take that quote data and use it to compare it to your service order data and then to make sure that you get the actual quote that you're getting in the actual contract. All right, so I'm gonna move on to the telecom ordering process. So once we've selected a vendor, selected a circuit, you need to order it and fulfill it, and there's a bunch of key processes around this. When you look at ordering, the ordering process is really an extension of the sourcing process, so that when you select a quote from a vendor, you really want to understand that that quote is going to be provided to you when you get the service order. So you want to make sure you get the right pricing. Another example is looking at optimizing the selection of the right service provider. And what I mean, in this particular example I'll go through is like if you're sourcing out DIDs, so if you're for like a UC service, so you're gonna use CLEX for your local inbound, so you're sourcing your DIDs. If you had four providers that covered the United States, and each have their own coverage data, so you really have to have an optimal system that helps you go through that process to understand, because you could have, if just as an example, if you had like level 3 IntelliQuint, Peerless, and Bandwidth, say, as 4 providers, they price vastly differently and they offer different capabilities. So you need to have some way to optimize that selection of that provider. So and things like the type of service. If you're selling a line as a fax line, that only level 3 probably would be able to provide that service. But in terms of the rates that they charge for the DID itself, as well as the usage that it generates, you really need to kind of be able to optimize that. Have to be able to ensure that your order process yields the right outcomes, and at the lowest cost. And so when you look at these back office processes, there's two ways, there's two components of cost. It's the actual cost to perform the process, which is typically labor and system cost. And there's the actual result of the process itself, like the cost of the circuit or the process, time flow. And so these are all two important costs that both need to be managed. But on the order process, you really need to have on-time orders. There's the big risk here if you really can damage customer experience if you have a bad order process, that the order gets reworked 3 or 4 times and then delays. And so you've got to make sure that you don't want to disrupt that customer experience. This is typically, if it's a new customer, it's their first experience with you, so you want to get this right and kind of get that customer relationship off to a good start. Again, automation, you have to scale and drive lower costs. What I see a lot are Excel, Outlook, Salesforce, those types of platforms being used for order processing and inventory and that sort of thing. And these things don't scale. They don't alert you. They're not really built for this type of or for any type of volume. So really, automation is key in this area. And then the last thing is, again, the life cycle is an integrated set of processes. So as you get information from the order process, like the service order itself, you need to be able to easily search it and retrieve it and kind of use it downstream in the process, like using the service order, which is the contract, in your cost management processes. Very important to integrate all these processes. All right, now that we've selected our quote and did our order and the order is installed, there's a set of recurring processes that need to be performed as the service now is in service. I'm going to walk through these. On the fixed expense side, so the circuits and those sorts of things, so once the circuit has been put into, or the service has been put into service, you've created a liability for the organization, and so you need to know that. And so you need to have a strong inventory system that tells you, an order system that tells you, hey, now I have a new item. And so, because that item's not going to show up on a bill for probably 2 to 3 months, so you really need to accrue for it in your accounting, so that you maintain accurate and compliant, GAAP compliant type financials. Another thing that happens, so once the next big event really is when a new item, when this item that you've installed and it's been in service appears on the bill. Again, 2 to 3 months down the road, it appears on the bill for the first time. There's a whole bunch of activities that need to be performed. First one is really just reconciling that. So assuming you have a good inventory system, leveraging your inventory, and maybe if you use POs, purchase orders, to order circuits to, really to validate that that circuit that's now showing up on the bill is legitimate and it was ordered. Then you need to validate the MRC, looking at the service order again, or the contract, the MRC and the NRC. That'll show up on the first bill as well. And then using the install date. So a lot of times these are areas where the carriers get things wrong, where the circuit may have been installed, but the test didn't prove out, so it wasn't accepted. So it took 2 or 3 more weeks for the vendor to make the circuit acceptable. They'll basically, the carrier is going to start the billing from when they claim the install date is, but really, if you have good records and a system that tracks this, you can dispute that and kind of save some of the prior period charges that are going to show up on the bill. This one area, I think, is one of the key areas where I see revenue or margin leakage from the process, where dates don't line up and there's more billing than there should be, and it kind of it's really manifests itself in a lot of little charges that add up to a decent amount of money. The last thing is you have to assign some type of general ledger coding so you're sure that your charges are booked properly. In the following months after the service now is in recurring, so you really should have a recurring process that validates that the circuit is billing as it should, and it's in inventory, it's billing, it's active, and then validating that MRC. On the usage side, there's some other things that need to be done on a regular basis. Some best practice there are reconciling your internal CDRs on your platform to your carrier rated CDRs to make sure the volumes and the calls and minutes are trending or pretty close. You're never going to get it 100% accurate in terms of match, but you have to be within some 1 to 2% off there. Re-rating the carrier CDRs is a good practice. Again, they don't build. We do this all the time. We have a platform that does this, but so we don't see lots of overbilling all the time. But every once in a while, we had one last week. One of my analysts found about $130,000 overbilling, and really what was tied to, and most of them are tied to, is when the rate decks change. They change every month. The carrier didn't update the new rate deck, and there's a significant change and a significant switch in traffic mix, and so it resulted in significant overbilling for a pretty large customer. So it's worthwhile to do on a regular basis. Other things you need visibility into the traffic mix and see if when mix change, when if different jurisdictions change or certain call patterns, you really need to be able to tell that. And so sometimes it could be fraud, sometimes it's not. But understanding your average cost per minute, what drives those changes, and that sort of thing is very useful. You really have to do. Fraud detection is another thing that you really have to have. I do have some customers that I've worked with that don't quite have it in place or don't have the process in place once fraud is identified to really shut it down. But fraud is really rampant in the telecom industry on the usage side. Poses a very big risk. We've had customers that have had fraud events ranging from $200,000 to $500,000 over a weekend. They typically happen on weekends because the NOC and other people are less aware, or not working as much. So look out for that. I heavily suggest or recommend you invest in a good fraud detection platform. Then the last thing is leveraging least cost and quality-based routing for both outbound and toll-free. So if you're not doing multi-carrier toll-free, you really should be. There's great value to be had for that from the cost perspective as well as from the quality of service perspective. All right, so the last part of the life cycle that I'll go through is the decommission process. So this is, again, talking through the life cycle of a circuit as an example. This is when customer cancels, and then the whole process to remove that service from that circuit from service and handle all the financial side of this. So again, another very important process. I see holes in this part of the process a lot that cause a lot of issues, which we'll kind of point out some of them in the next couple of slides. From a best practice standpoint, there has to be this really solid closed loop process. So when a customer disconnects service with the carriers, typically going to be that information is typically handled and received first by either sales or customer care. So there's got to be this linkage to handle that on the billing side, as well as passing that over to network operations to kind of close the loop. Again, requires accurate inventory so they can identify which network facilities the customer is using and which network facilities need to be disconnected so we can stop the billing. Really, again, another linkage here is to contract information, customer contracts. So, there's actually both types of contracts. So customer-facing contracts, so that you ensure that you have, and hopefully have language in there that you can pass basically the rest of the term of the billing, the revenue onto the customer, but also on the vendor side, looking at if there are any termination liabilities. So, if a customer disconnects early, chances are the term of the circuit still had term, and with most vendors, you're going to have some liability. Again, I mentioned portability on the sourcing side. So some of this liability can be mitigated through having good contracts and good portability. Sometimes it just can't be mitigated, but again, hopefully in those cases you have in your contract with your customer the ability to pass it on to them since they're terminating the contract early. Another important thing to do is when you go through the process of issuing a disconnect order is to understand the interval that the carrier has and uses to stop the billing. So in some cases, carriers have a 30-day interval from the receipt and acceptance of a disconnect order. In others, it's pretty much a day or two past the actual date that the order is accepted. But you're gonna, the problem is with carrier billing is that if you disconnect 1 month, you're still going to get billed for that circuit 2 to 3 months after that. And so knowing when that stop billing date is crucial to calculating what your credit should be, your prorated billing, so making sure that's accurate. And so having a systems capability around that is very useful as well. But this is, again, one of those areas where margin leakage happens because the carriers keep billing, and if you don't catch it, then you're paying more than you should have for those facilities. All of these best practices, can result in some great, optimization, great cost structure. These are just some examples of our customers that we've done work for, both as services as well as some with software. So first one I'll run through really quickly, these three case studies. First one is more of a channel focused UCaaS provider. We engaged with them in early 2018. We renegotiated all their vendor contracts, designed and implemented LCR for them, and we actually run their LCR on an ongoing basis. This one, we drove savings, annualized savings and realized savings greater than $5 million, about 50% of their telco. And that number in itself drove really significant margin expansion, almost double-digit margin expansion. It also did some great stuff on the operational side. We created this, great, agile, resilient voice network capability with multiple carrier options where they only had a few locked in and they weren't routing based on cost or quality in the prior. We gave them deeper market reach. We gave them a lot more vendors and to go into certain parts of the country, gave them more flexibility on the DID side. Next one was a retail-focused UCaaS provider. So again, there we renegotiated all their major network services contracts. We optimized the routing. Great savings there too, about $1.3 million in sourcing base, savings released from our sourcing work, and about $750K on the routing side. Similar type of result too, operationally, more resilient networks, flexible contracts. Really, a lot of these, what we see out there when we get into the contract side of things, we see that vendors have, or customers have really onerous terms in their contracts, which don't really buy them anything in terms of rate and cost savings, but just make it very inflexible to deal with vendors. And so that's one of our key values out of our sourcing side, is to kind of make contracts very flexible and enable the use of multiple carriers. The last one was more on the circuit-based side. The fixed side is a data center provider. This one was a very large carrier, over $100 million in network spend. The work we did there was, first thing was reconciling the circuit inventory, about 65,000 circuits. Also renegotiated a lot of those contracts that those circuits were on. We drove about a little over $4 million in savings through getting rid of basically, this is pretty incredible. There were, again, over $4 million of annual savings of customer circuits where the customer had left, within, left a year, 2, 3 years prior. So they've been paying for these circuits and having them still in service when the customer's not there. So that was pretty big. On the sourcing side, we drove about a little over $6 million savings there. Again, more flexible contract terms, which is really great for them to go forward. All right, so one last slide here. This, I just want to, this is our shameless plug here, tell you a little bit more about our services. So again, at the outset, I mentioned that we offer both SaaS and professional services. Our SaaS platform is called GPX Cloud. We believe, we feel it's the first real comprehensive and integrated SaaS network service lifecycle management. So handling all the functions that a lot of what I talked about today, but handling the functions of vendor, network service quoting, order management, network inventory, cost management, contract management, usage management, and analytics are all wrapped around that. And as I mentioned throughout the webinar today, it's real important to have integration across the life cycle. So as you do quoting, the quote data is very useful in the ordering process. In the ordering process, the documents that come out of that, like this, the service order or the contract, is very useful in the auditing or cost management piece. And so very important to have an integrated platform to drive cost management as well as network operational efficiency across the process. In terms of our platform, really, we think the three values that it offers is supporting scalable customer growth, enhancing profitability, and really enhancing the customer experience through what kind of we offer there. On the professional services side, we do a lot of work with emerging carriers through network sourcing, optimization, routing, inventory reconciliation, and invoice audits. And so some great benefits that accrue from our professional services. We generate consistently significant savings for the companies we work with, and a lot of times we'll be engaged up front with a services engagement which will drive some savings and create funding for the SaaS platform. And the SaaS platform, once in place, can help you manage that going forward on that process. And so anyways, I think that's all I had today. I want to turn it over to Olivia and go through some Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris, for your time today and sharing this important information about automating your back office. Before we begin the QA portion of the presentation, I'd like to first go over a couple of housekeeping items. So just as a reminder, the recording will be emailed to you within 2 weeks. And if you haven't already, please submit your questions into the GoToWebinar questions box on the side of this presentation. And if we don't get to your question during the event, we will be following up with you individually via email. So the first question I have here, Chris, is, in your experience, where do you see most emerging providers starting to implement these best practices in the telecom life cycle? Is it sourcing, ordering, in-service processes?
Okay, great. So so a lot of the emerging carriers, we see some of this implemented, but for the most part, like if I go through the functional areas like quoting, we see some of that. There's certainly some quoting vendors. They're more single solution vendors that do quoting. So we see certainly some using those vendors. There's not a lot going on the ordering side, mainly because in the telecom space, there really aren't a lot of great interfaces like RESTful APIs to do service ordering. There's a bunch to do quoting, but very few to do ordering. So they're still using kind of 1980s era technology for the ordering, for doing like electronic ASRs. And so not a lot of companies are doing that level of that. As well as when you get into the in-service side, there's some that are doing cost management, but tends to be more ad hoc. What I've really noticed out in the space is that it seems that a lot more investment is being done on the revenue generation side. So we're more of a cost-focused side of what we look at. And so, but one thing I want to point out around that is, if you focus on the cost side, just to give a quick example, if you have a carrier that has a 40% gross margin and you can save $1 million, say annually on the cost side, that's equivalent based on that margin to $2.5 million of revenue. So it's pretty valuable to focus on the cost side as well. I think you can do both. I think you can focus on revenue and cost. So
Great. The next question here is, are these best practices also relevant for newer services like SD-WAN?
Oh, awesome question. So yeah, absolutely. So it seems like SD-WAN was like the network service of the year last year in 2018. It was a really big thing. And I personally would recommend anyone that's doing unified communication should also offer SD-WAN because it is a great complement to UC to ensure that the bandwidth that the UC packets are traveling across is optimal. And so, but when you look at the service requirements to deploy like an SD-WAN, to offer SD-WAN services, it really intensifies what I talked about. So the quoting, the ordering, the inventory, because if you're selling an SD-WAN service, you're not just selling one location, you're most likely selling it in multi-location. If you have an enterprise that has 5 or 6 or 10 locations, you're now going to have to source their connectivity at all locations. And so it's a much more intense quoting capability and quoting requirement. And so if you're getting into SD-WAN, you're going to really want to kind of make sure you have a really solid and automated back office.
Awesome. And I think our last question for the day is, how does Cloud Age Solutions complement billing solutions like Rev.io?
Oh, great question too. So we're completely complementary. So we again, as what I talked about today, we focus more on the network cost side, and Rev.io is focused more on the customer facing side, so billing and those customer facing processes. So so we're very complementary there, and we actually have a project going on right now where we're integrating. So Rev.io came out with a great REST API last year, which we're in the process of implementing too. And so with that REST API and that capability for us to pull in the billing or revenue data, we're looking at developing a customer profitability analysis capability. So, as on the network cost side, we have all of the underlying costs like the circuits and the usage, and we can integrate that at a customer level and take the Rev.io billing data at a customer level and put together a gross margin analysis by customer very quickly and easily. And so we're really excited about getting that integration done and getting that capability into GPX Cloud, because it's really going to drive a lot of value for our customer, for our mutual customer. So yeah, we're very excited about it.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much, Chris, for taking the time to join us on our partner co-branded webinar series. And thank you to our audience for joining us today. I hope you have a great rest of your week.
Yeah, thank you, Olivia. This was great. I appreciate it, and I appreciate everyone for joining us today. And any questions, just feel free to reach out.
Thanks again.
All right, thank you.